Remington A.D. Campbell, and this is the History of Musical Theatre podcast. I'm going to begin today's episode with some minor heresy. I'm going to read to you a portion of Stephen Sondheim's book, Finishing the Hat, and we're going to listen out for the error. The notion. Romeo and Juliet, transposed to New York City, 1957. The Montagues and Capulets are two gangs, the Jets, white, and the Sharks, Puerto Rican. The lovers are Tony, Romeo, a former member of the Jets, and Maria, Juliet, the sister of Bernardo, Paris, the leader of the Sharks. Riff, Mercutio, is the leader of the Jets and Tony's best friend. Did you catch it? If you know very much about me, you'll know that I am a massive Shakespeare nerd. Shakespeare is my jam. Romeo and Juliet was the first Shakespeare and possibly the first sad film I ever saw. My mum helped translate as we watched, giving a rough approximation of, I want to say, in excess of every third line. I was stunned by that film. I walked around the house for the next few days in a stupor, uttering, but they died, to myself. How could this be the greatest love story? Denial is the first stage of grief. In my Year 6 show, I helped write and perform a parody of Romeo and Juliet. I was in a youth production of the show playing Benvolio and Lady Capulet on alternating nights. I know this show. And let me tell you something. Bernardo isn't Paris. Paris is the man Juliet's father wants her to marry. His West Side Story equivalent is Chino. Bernardo is Tybalt, Juliet's cousin, who, in the words of his uncle, is a very saucy boy. Yes, all of the teenagers in the youth production I did thought that was hilarious. Riff is also sort of a cross between Mercutio and Benvolio. He fulfills the narrative role of Mercutio, i.e. dying at the end of the first act, but he is undoubtedly Jets affiliated, whereas Mercutio wasn't a Montague. So he's a little like Benvolio, Romeo's cousin, part of the conflict. But you know what? I'll let that one slide since, it doesn't imply incest. Also, I know, spoilers, but if your high school English teacher didn't make you read Romeo and Juliet, I really don't see how that's my fault. The way I've started out makes it sound like Mr. Sondheim isn't a certifiable musical theatre genius and considered one of the foremost composers and lyricists of all time. I don't think that. I love Sondheim's work. Into the Woods has many roles I would love to play one day. Opening Doors from Merrily We Roll Along is great. Mrs. Lovett, enough said. I bought his annotated lyrics, which is where I got his mistake quote from. And look, I'm seriously considering buying the Sondheim Encyclopedia when it comes out at the end of the year. I'm a Sondheim fan. So let's talk about the youth and early career of one Mr. Stephen Sondheim. West Side Story comes really early in Sondheim's career, especially when compared with Jerome Robbins and Leonard Bernstein. I didn't want to commit double heresy by only doing half an episode on Sondheim. I don't want someone to show up and step ball change me to death. So instead, I'm also going to look at some of his lyrics and look at the ways that his youth influenced them and the way that his genius was still evident throughout. I'm going to do this with the help of Finishing the Hat, his first book of annotated lyrics. And massive thank you to my dad for this idea. He might not be a musical theatre fan, but he is a Helping Remy fan. He actually has a rule that basically he'll only see musicals if he has a blood relative in them. So I forced him to see many, many more musicals than he would have ever wanted to. And we also saw Matilda. That was good. That's a good show. So, early history, and then lyric analysis for nerds. Stephen Sondheim was born on the 22nd of March, 1930. It's actually the same day, although a different year, as Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber. I think we should declare March 22nd, if not World Musical Day, then maybe World Contemporary Musical Day. I honestly think I'm just going to start celebrating it, and hopefully other people will get with the program. Sondheim's early childhood wasn't a happy one. It's sometimes reported that his parents' marriage was one of convenience. Herbert and Janet were both in the same industry and of marriageable age. They agreed to marry, and if either of them found someone else they liked, they would have a quiet divorce. Look, I haven't been married for ages, but from what I've seen of other people's successful marriages, I have a pro tip. Don't enter a marriage like that. Just maybe don't. Over the years, his mother actually fell in love with his father. I imagine it a little bit like My Fair Lady's I've grown accustomed to his face. Sondheim liked his father a great deal. Herbert was a talented piano player, playing predominantly by ear, and introducing Stephen to the instrument. His parents threw large parties, and he was often called upon to play for the guests. The first musical he saw was in 1936, White Horse Inn. Perhaps not the most intellectually stimulating or groundbreaking show on offer that year, but a significant experience for young Sondheim. This was the same year that On Your Toes debuted. His love of musicals and of music didn't keep him at the piano, though. Tiring of his parents' requests for him to play at event after event, he gave up the instrument. In 1940, when Stevie, as he was often called, was 10, Herbert met another woman and invoked the marriage's out clause. Again, maybe don't have one of those in your marriage. After that, Sondheim was left with his mother, who was reportedly a frightful woman. She'd later say to Sondheim that she wished he hadn't been born. Funnily enough, he understood what she meant. About the situation, Sondheim would later say, "I had a difficult childhood because my mother was a genuinely monstrous woman, and my father, whom I liked a lot, left me in the dragon's lair. I can't blame him, but I blame him." He was then sent to military school, something pretty common for the children of divorced parents. It was thought to give them the stability that their home life no longer could. There he took up the organ and reportedly used it as a tool to get out of sport, something I support completely. He stayed at the school 1 year and in that time skipped a grade. "We get it, Stephen. You're smarter than everyone. You still got Romeo and Juliet wrong in your book though, just saying." He would then move to a new school in Newtown, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately not Newtown, Sydney, which is close to where I grew up. It wasn't close to where I grew up, but it was close to the Bucks County estate his mother had purchased. In spite of her many failings, Janet, or Foxy as she was often known, did something remarkable for her son and for musical theatre history. Foxy was a designer trying to re-establish her career, and she had a friend who lived near who was an interior designer named Dorothy. If you listened last season, you may remember a Dorothy or two. Bucks County, Pennsylvania was home to Dorothy and Oscar Hammerstein, as well as their son, James. Oscar Hammerstein II was a well-known lyricist, and in 1942 he was in the earliest stages of a brand new partnership with Richard Rodgers. I wrote a whole season about the first show they wrote together. You should be able to find it pretty much wherever you listen to this podcast. But before I talk more about the Hammersteins, back to school. Towards the end of his time at the military academy, Sondheim actually met Dorothy and Jimmy, or James, Hammerstein. Maybe it was later. With a lot of these biographical details, different people report different things. Thanks, history. First you give me two guys who are both married to girls named Dorothy, then you give me names that I struggle to pronounce, and now you're giving me two different reports of how people met. The way I'm gonna tell it, Foxy's friend Dorothy brought her son, James, to meet her friend's son, Stephen, at the end of the school year. The summer was undoubtedly life-changing. Also world-changing. You know, that too. Sonny, another nickname for Stephen, quickly became a regular at the Hammerstein house. Oscar and Dorothy's son Jimmy was around the same age, and they became friends. There was an initial plan for Stevie to go off to summer camp, but he asked instead to be allowed to spend his days with Oscar and Jimmy. It was cancelled, and musical theatre history would never be the same. I'm getting there. A frequent guest over the summer at the Hammerstein house was Richard Rogers, along with his wife, another Dorothy, and their children, Linda and Mary. Mary Rogers would go on to write the musical Once Upon a Mattress and be a lifelong friend of Sondheim's. The Hammerstein family was reasonably competitive. Or maybe very, 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 very competitive. In his book, The Hammersteins, Oscar Arthur Hammerstein, grandson of Oscar Hammerstein II, grandson of Oscar Hammerstein I, reports a time when Stevie and Jimmy were playing Monopoly. The latter accused the former of cheating. The former then hit the latter. He was cheating, though. Funny anecdote, terrible interpersonal skills. At the end of that summer, Sondheim went back to school, now at the George School in Newtown, Pennsylvania. He would spend his school years taking every theatrical opportunity presented to him and generally being a smarty pants. I'd like to interview Stephen Sondheim one day, and I'm starting to think that the things I'm saying may not be conducive to that. Whoops. 1945 was a big year for musical theatre. 2 shows of definitely equal quality, I promise, were presented to the world. The first was Rogers and Hammerstein's Carousel, an adaptation of the play Lilum, which contains some of musical theatre's most beloved songs, like You'll Never Walk Alone and Soliloquy. It also contains a personal favourite soprano comedic song, Mr. Snow. If I can get good enough at that song, I may have some exciting news. The other show was By George, Stephen Sondheim's first show, which played 3 performances at his school, and was not so subtly about the school. It was also the source of endless inside jokes. The next summer, Oscar offered to read Sondheim's show and give his critiques. Sondheim, who was legitimately considering in his own mind if he was going to be the youngest person ever to have written a show on Broadway, asked Oscar to hold no punches. Review this as if you were a producer and this musical came across your desk. Oscar was just obviously jealous that Sondheim had written the superior show and was very harsh. In all seriousness, By George was not a good show. But for a show written by a high schooler about their school, it was pretty exceptional. But Sonny was going to have to wait a few more years for Broadway. It was in the Hammerstein house that Sondheim received his early musical theatre training. He wanted to be like Oscar and write for the theatre. Stevie showed his surrogate father his original play, his original musical, and Oscar gave stern critiques. The play was awful, but the effort was admirable. So Hammerstein gave him a 4-part assignment, taken from Oscar Hammerstein III's book. 1. Write a musical. All of it. Book, music, lyrics. For a good play. 2. Do the same for a not-so-good play. 3. Now adapt a play from a novel or short story. 4. Last, write an original musical. This writing assignment would take him through college and prove pretty instrumental in training him. He went to Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, to attend the Liberal Arts College's theatre program. His first teacher, Robert Barrow, was, and I quote, very dry, making him hated by the wider student population, but loved by the dry-witted Sondheim. It was in those classes that he began to understand the value of music theory in composition. If you know his later works, you'll see this fairly clearly, unless you're like me and you don't actually understand music theory. Though holy moly, Stephen Sondheim loved music theory. I'm going to link in the description and in the show notes 2 different videos of people breaking down the music of 2 different Sondheim shows that he wrote both music and lyrics for, which just illustrate this point so beautifully. The shows are Into the Woods and Sweeney Todd, which are 2 of his more popular shows, and holy moly, that guy was smart. With his new understanding of musical theory, he needed someone to teach him more. His decision to go to a theatre program rather than a music one was largely due to the scorn he'd noticed from music people towards theatre music. He was recommended to study with Milton Babbitt. They would meet for 4 hours each week, both travelling into New York. They would spend their time dissecting music, starting with show music and then moving on to more classical pieces. While Oscar was in previews for Carousel, his second show with Richard Rodgers, he got Stevie a job as an assistant, typing and getting pastries and coffee mostly, but he was in the world of theatre. At the same time, Hammerstein was working with Rodgers on Allegro, which was not a particularly successful show. Rodgers ended up blaming the show's failure on the choreographer Agnes DeMille, which ended the trio's partnership. Critical consensus suggests that it probably wasn't her fault. Sondheim also began Hammerstein's writing task at college, beginning by adapting Kaufman and Connolly's Beggar on Horseback, which he retitled All That Glitters. He was actually given the rights to produce the show, an impressive run of 3 performances. That was the good play. In Sondheim's words, High Tour was a flawed play, and he wrote an adaptation as the second part of the task. He didn't get the rights to this play, as the author was already considering an adaptation with Kurt Weill. I can imagine Sondheim's pitch, though. So, Oscar told me to write a series of 4 musicals, adapting from a good play, a bad play, a novel or short story, and then an original one. Anyway, I'm on the second one, and I was hoping you'd give me the rights to your play. Yeah, the bad play. The other 2 shows he wrote was an unfinished adaptation of P.L. Travers' Mary Poppins, not the Disney one, and a 4-hour piece called Climb High. I guess he hadn't yet heard the key piece of writing advice, Kill Your Darlings. Maybe it could be a good show. I feel like you just need George Abbott to join on. Be a quick 1-act. Well, aside from All That Glitters, none of these shows ever had any performances. They did provide really good audition material for Mr. Sondheim. His first professional show was Saturday Night. He was a New Yorker, and this show is set in New York, but it turns out that Manhattan, where Sondheim grew up, and Brooklyn, where the show is set, are totally different worlds. It was doing this show that he realized he had a knack for mimicry and really enjoyed finding new rhymes. Unrelated anecdote. When I was small, I loved rhymes. I still really like them, but I really loved rhymes. And I'd sit in the car and we'd be driving around and I'd just say words that rhymed with each other. The problem was I didn't understand what a swear word was, and so I'd start on about pit, twit, knit, and so on, or truck, duck, muck, etc. My parents found 4-year-old me's incidental swearing mildly hilarious. Saturday Night had 4 producer auditions, when they show material from the show to producers to get funding, and raised half of what they needed. But then tragedy hit. Lemuel Ayers, who was producing the show, died. The show had been slated for the 1954-55 Broadway season, but when the rights fell to his surviving wife, her inexperience with show business left the production unable to continue. If I died, and the rights to this show passed on to my husband, it would also be unable to continue. He has since had some critiques of the show, but hasn't gone back and reworked it because, quote, you don't retouch baby photos. Sondheim was friends with director, lyricist, and librettist Bert Shelove. At the time, he'd written lyrics for and directed Small Wonder, and he would later work with Sondheim on A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum and The Frogs, as well as directing tributes to both Sondheim and Rodgers and Hart. Well, Bert invited Sondheim to a party, and Sondheim arrived first. Looking around the party, he saw only one familiar face. Arthur Lawrence, who I'll be talking about in 2 episodes' time. Lawrence had been at some of the Saturday night producer auditions. They began to talk, and Arthur mentioned he was working on an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. Robbins and Bernstein had initially hoped to work again with writers and comedians Bertie Comden and Adolph Green, but they were stuck in a Hollywood contract. I know! The horror! Lawrence set up an audition for Sondheim with Leonard Bernstein. Bernstein was actually planning on writing the lyrics himself, but agreed to hear the young lyricist. He was impressed, but unconvinced, until he had a phone call with Oscar Hammerstein. Pro tip, if you want to be successful in an industry, it really helps to have a certified genius speak for you. If anyone wants to be my certified genius mentor, send me an email, or even better, send Cameron McIntosh or John M. Chu an email and tell them I'm great. Yeah, that would be much appreciated. Thanks, guys. With Hammerstein's approval, Stephen Sondheim joined the team. Because of how short Sondheim's career was pre-West Side Story, it was his first Broadway show, I wanted to go into a little breakdown of some of the lyrics. The lyrics in West Side Story demonstrate both Stephen's youth and his skill. On the one hand, there's I Feel Pretty, which he has fairly publicly criticised. It was written later on in the process, and the new lyricist was ready to show the world what he could do. The song begins, I feel pretty, oh so pretty, I feel pretty and witty and bright, and I pity any girl who's in me tonight. Those lyrics would be perfectly in place in a Cole Porter show. One can imagine them coming out of the mouth of a character like Reno Sweeney, but not a young Puerto Rican girl with English as a second language. He also wrote the lyrics sung by the other girls in the room, also ESL Puerto Rican immigrants. Put on your mantilla, Maria, and put silver combs in your hair. A touch of perfume from Sevilla, there won't be a prettier girl anywhere. Those lyrics didn't make it into the show, which is probably good. The song he attributes most to the influence of Oscar Hammerstein is definitely Maria, which is sung by Tony. It's a love song early on in the show, pretty much Tony's equivalent of I Feel Pretty. And at this point, the show's leading characters barely know each other. Stephen didn't just want to write a silly love song. Tony doesn't know anything about this girl, except her name, Maria. Hence the title of the song. Interestingly, not the first musical with a song with that name. Revenge with Music and Music Hath Charms both contain songs entitled Maria. Sondheim's one main regret in that song was the lyric, say it soft and it's almost like praying. Earlier versions of the show, particularly when it was about Irish Catholics and Jews, and then even a little bit when it became American Polish immigrants and Puerto Ricans, emphasized Tony's Catholic background a little bit more strongly. But in the final production, it was left a little bit more ambiguous. And Stephen felt that without the wider context, the lyric felt too wet, in contrast to the much-loved dryness of Robert Barrow. Incidentally, Maria was Oscar and Dorothy Hammerstein's favourite song in the show. The videos I mentioned earlier, which break down two Sondheim shows, Into the Woods and Sweeney Todd, are well worth watching. I don't have a music background, especially not a music background like these people have one. And Stephen didn't write the music for West Side Story, so it wouldn't really be appropriate for me to go into a detailed breakdown of his music. But know that it's brilliant, and the videos are definitely worth watching if you're curious to see how he used concepts from music theory to write and expand scores and create shows which are really cohesive. Next episode is going to be a little bit of a break in form. I'm going to be interviewing the daughter of West Side Story's undercredited co-choreographer Peter Gennaro, who choreographed America and parts of Dance at the Gym, basically all the Sharks choreography. We'll be talking about his early career and his experience working on West Side Story. You might have also noticed that we are moving to a fortnightly episode release schedule. This works better for me as I'm preparing for a couple of other exciting things, and means that Ollie doesn't have to edit episodes in 3 days. Until then, something's coming, and it's gonna be great.